David Essel, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate you joining me for this conversation.
Oh, Scott, we've been looking forward to it. I know we're going to have a great time.
Absolutely. So just start off by telling the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and what led you onto the path that got you to where you are today.
Oh my gosh. Well, sports, Scott, have always been a huge part of my existence. Starting at 6 years of age, I write about it in our new book for athletes. I started sleeping with a basketball in my bed. So I knew right there, and my mom and dad knew pretty much that this was going to be my life. I didn't know it would end up in the way that it ended up, because back then, up until I was probably about 17 or 18 years of age, I knew I was going to be an NBA star, Scott. I mean, I just knew there was no one that could ever stop me until I went to a couple really good basketball camps, and I realized if I could play Division I, that would be great, but I'm probably not going any further. But so I got a degree in sports psychology, and then I went further and went heavily into counseling. Over the last number of years, I've worked with athletes from almost every sport imaginable, from BMX to tennis to weight training, basketball, baseball, football, etc. And, the quest that we are on is to help athletes, whether it's elite college athletes. We even just had a father who has a 12-year-old son who has incredible golf skills from everything the father said. But when he goes to putt, if he isn't putting on game the way he expects to, he loses it emotionally. Well, and I said to the father, I go, listen, I work with professional athletes that still struggle like this, so if he's at 12, he's going to start working with me to help understand emotional regulation. Oh my gosh, and so a long story short, I've been in the business for 43 years, the author of 14 books. Also, a host of my own podcast, Scott, and we've been doing this out of love of sport, out of love of helping people heal, out of love of helping people to maximize their potential in all of life.
And was that your way when you realized, like so many of us do, me included, I realized very early on that I was not going to be a professional hockey player or a professional baseball player? Because when you're a mediocre player on your 13-year-old team, you kind of get the clue that it's not going to be your vocation. Was it just a matter for you of saying, I want to be involved in sports in some way, if it's not being a player?
It's a great question, Scott. Yeah, when I went to Syracuse University, and I was a walk-on, Division I basketball walk-on, and I knew at those, and when I was there for the first 2 years, it was just pure bliss. I mean, I had the most incredible time. But my junior year, the head coach back then was a guy named Roy Danforth. Of course, most people associate basketball in Syracuse with Jim Boeheim, who just retired, right? So Adrian Autry, a former player, is taking over as the head coach now. But when I was playing back then, and we got to my junior year, Roy Danforth called me in. He was the head coach, and he said, Essel, he goes, you've been amazing the last 2 years. He said, and I've got great news for you. He said, how bad do you want a spot on the team, Syracuse University, moving forward? Of course, Scott, I freaked out. I said, oh my gosh, Coach Danforth, it's what I was born for. I was raised in Syracuse, for God's sake. This is a dream come true. He said, my son, you've got it. You've got your scholarship for the next 2 years. The first 2 years as a walk-on, all of a sudden I'm going to get a scholarship. I'm freaking out, Scott, but then he lands this big line on me, and he says, so I'm going to tell you something. We got an amazing group of young players coming in that are just incredible. I need you in practice to push them harder than they'll ever even face in a game. Are you with me? And I'm sitting there going, uh-oh. Now we're getting a sales pitch, right? And I said, yes, coach, I'm with you. He said, great. He said, now you're going to push them, and you're going to push them. And he said, the only downside is you will probably never get in a game. And I said, wow. I'm sitting there, Scott, thinking this, my mind is going crazy. And I said, coach, never? And he said, we need you. We need you in the role we have set out for you. I've saved this slot for you. Tell me you're going to take it. And I said, coach, I need 24 hours. And I went home and talked to Jake the Snake Jacoby, my roommate at the time. And we stayed up to about 5 a.m., Scott. And it came to that, school was a struggle for me. And so I knew playing Division I basketball was going to be a challenge because, my God, you devote most of your time to practice, training, whatever it might be, and then you've got to find time to study. And so I went in the next day and I said, Coach Danforth, I really appreciate the opportunity, but I'm going to pass. I know for me to be on the bench for the next 2 years is going to be very difficult, never getting into a game, potentially never getting into a game. And Scott, I knew two guys I've been very good friends with that were walk-ons that they did the same thing. They got the last 2 years as a scholarship, but they never played. And I saw how tough it was for them. And they told me how difficult it was, but both of them thought it was the right decision. Mm-hmm. But when I made that decision, I also knew there had to be another slot for me in sport. I wasn't going to give it up that easy. And then I took a couple years off for my undergraduate. And when I went back for my graduate, I knew exactly I wanted to be in sports psychology. And that allowed me to stay in an environment that I love more than a freaking anything that I can imagine. And, in the book, we tell all these stories of athletes I've worked with, athletes I've met. I've got a great intro about Moses Malone, one of the greatest forward centers to ever play the game, although I don't think he's gotten the credibility he should. Scott, how many forward centers at 6'10" score 50 points and get 30 rebounds in the same game? How many guys at his size were able to pull off what he did? 2 MVPs in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, in 2015, he died in his sleep of a heart attack. But I met him when he was 17 and I was 15. And I tell the story in the book. It was a phenomenal experience. This kid, I was up in Dave Bing's camp in Pocono Pines, Pennsylvania, and all of a sudden this limousine pulls up. Now, we're Pocono Pines, Pennsylvania is in the middle of nowhere. And all of a sudden this limousine pulls up and this kid gets out, tall, skinny kid. He's got this torn, dirty white t-shirt on, short Scott that's held up by a safety pin, shoes with barely enough laces to keep him on his feet, and there was hardly any sole left. And we see this kid get out of this limousine, this camp, and go, who the heck is that? And it ended up being Moses Malone. And then over the loudspeaker later on that night, it said at 7 p.m., former All-Star Dave Bing challenges newcomer Moses Malone to a one-on-one contest, center court. And of course, all these campers, we went nuts because we're sitting there thinking, Moses Malone, a 17-year-old kid against Dave Bing. And at first, the first 10 points were tough. He played really well. And then Dave Bing did what Dave Bing could do to anyone. Basically, with his experience, he just took off and took over. But, that was an experience I had that was mind-blowing. It really altered me in regards to meeting someone that was eventually going to become one of the greatest, I believe, one of the greatest forward centers in the league that's ever worn a uniform. And, he was a kid that came from nothing and he had a lot of struggles. So, we tell those kind of stories. And then we tell a story about, athletes that were high school or in college, they were wide receivers, and a freak accident. And I'll never forget this. One of the guys that I worked with, he was a wide receiver in college, and he wanted to be a wide receiver in NFL. One day he's playing catch with his quarterback, and the next day the quarterback doesn't show up for their route running in the summer, and he starts kicking the ball, just kicking it by himself. He's waiting for the quarterback to come. On the other side of the field, there's a coach walking by and sees this ball punted higher than he's ever seen in his life, and he goes, who in the heck is that? And he comes around the corner. He goes, my son, you just found yourself a new position. You're our punter. Where did you get these skills? You're going to go to the NFL. And I shared that story, Scott, because there's a lot of players in college that are in the wrong position. There are a lot of players that go into any sport in the pros and they find, look at Philadelphia Phillies. Oh my gosh, the first baseman.
Oh, I'm blanking right now.
I'm blanking on it too. He's one of the top stars in Major League Baseball. I can see his beard. I can see his face. I can't believe I'm forgetting it. But here's someone who now is becoming a respected first baseman. He was never expected to be a first baseman. Oh my God, what's his name? One of us got to remember before we leave. But, the book is full of these kind of stories. And then we also give tips, even for amateur athletes. We tell people, and you can get the Audible for free at our website. So if you want to listen to the book and not even buy it, you can go right to the website and get it for free. But then we give tips, that weekend athletes or serious amateur athletes in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s can take advantage of. So the book is a fun read. It's called, as a matter of fact, I have a copy right here, Mental Mastery and Maximum Performance for Professional Athletes. And so we tell stories, and then we also give tips. We have examples of clients that we've worked with where they do sizzle reels, the sizzle reel of them 4 minutes long maximum at their best. Under incredible pressure, maybe it's someone that never could hit sliders that all of a sudden he's hitting slider after slider. So we have a 4-minute sizzle reel created by the team to show him when he's doing well, exactly what his foot placement is, hand position, wrist position, the whole 9 yards. And then we do a 4-minute sizzle reel so the athlete can see themselves at their worst. And then we know this is your strength is never your problem in professional sports or anything in life. It's always that one thing, are you more dominant as a right-handed driver so the NBA can catch up to that very quick? You better learn how to use both hands equally well, and the same thing with a hitter, you may not be able to hit a slider, and if that's your Achilles heel, we better learn how to do that if we want to stay in
sliders. Yeah.
What'd you say?
They're going to throw you sliders if you can't
constantly, hit a slider. Scott, right? It's like, and we see that even in the playoffs right now. And so what we do when we work one-on-one with athletes is we really focus on their challenges, on their weaknesses. Maybe it's an attitude issue. Maybe there's certain players that get into their head, which can happen very, very easily, whether you're talking about baseball, football, basketball, hockey, it doesn't matter. There are certain guys that when you face them on the court or in a match, that they own your brain. They say certain things, they trigger you, they've got you emotionally. So we work with those kind of guys as well so that they can have that emotional resilience and learn how to let those things go in one ear and out the other. So there's a lot of cool things in the book, Scott, not just because I wrote it, but because for 43 years, I've dedicated my life to sport. And this is one of the books that exactly shows that.
Bryce Harper.
Oh, thank you very much, Bryce Harper. Oh my God,
I was thinking Mike Trout, Kyle Schwarber. Right. No, it's Bryce Harper. Yeah,
Bryce Harper.
And you talking about that reminds me of another story about someone that made it at a different position. Jason Kelce,
absolutely,
Philadelphia Eagles linebacker in college. Yeah. Gets to the pros, not going to make it as a linebacker. Now he's probably the best center in football. And, he's willing to it wasn't a pride. Oh, I'm a linebacker. I'm not a center. Yeah. He went with it and look where he is now.
And, as a matter of fact, watching him last night, right? Like Chris Collinsworth was saying that this guy by far is the best center in the league. And I mean, he even went as far to say that he believes their offensive and defensive line of the Eagles could be the best in the league as well. So yeah, and that's an example that the guy that I was talking about before, the punter, his name is Marquette King. Marquette went to the Raiders, and he was with the Raiders for a number of years. And then he went to the XFL last year, and he won the championship with Washington United, I think it was. I forget the name of the team, but they won the championship, and he was the punter there. So here was a guy that had always thought of himself as a wide receiver in the pros, but that one fateful day changed positions, and with that, we need to really look at as maybe high school, if parents of high school athletes are listening to us right now, or high school athletes themselves are listening, college athletes, am I in the right position? Am I where I'm supposed to be regarding my genetics and my own mental skills? We really need to look more closely at this. There's a number of players. I mean, you mentioned Bryce Harper. There's so many over the years that started off at first base and ended up in left field. They started off as a catcher and ended up at second base. There's all kinds of things. So, we need our athletes to slow down and make sure that they're where they're supposed to be. And number one, and then number two is to look at their weaknesses. I'm going to make this comment again, Scott, because it's so important. Our strengths do not get us in trouble in sports. It's our weaknesses that are always the pathway to frustration. So if we can take care of whatever those weaknesses are, and we look at people like Novak Djokovic, LeBron James, even Bryce Harper, these guys have weaknesses, but they've figured out ways to overcome their own weaknesses. And it's usually by putting themselves in that position on a regular basis to, let's say, face the slider, or with LeBron, his 3-point shooting has excelled over the years, but it didn't start out that way at all. So, he's probably one of those individuals that has mastered most, if not all, of his weaknesses. I think he's one of the few that it's really hard, even though he's aging right now, it's really hard to say that, he never could do X or he never did Y. Over the years, here's someone who dedicated himself to constant improvement of his challenges.
Let's get back to talking about college basketball and the experience of being that walk-on player that never plays but shows up every day to practice, makes it hard on the starters, makes it hard on the regular players. How hard is it to tell yourself as a young player who still has dreams about being a professional basketball player, how hard is it to tell yourself in that position that, hey, this is my best chance to help the team? Yeah. And what does it say about those kids that go out every day for 2 years in practice and bust their ass, knowing they're not going to get into a game? That is a commitment level that I would say is even beyond the commitment level of the starters, because there's no goal, there's no golden ring at the end of that journey.
Yeah. Scott, it's a great point. And, one of the things that we ended up being very proud of is that, at the end of practice, I'd always have guys on my team come up to me and say, would you take it easy? This isn't a playoff game. It's practice, for God's sake, and I never did. And I never did because of this. And I tell the story in the book. My freshman year in high school, I had a coach named Larry Miller. I'll never forget Larry Miller, and you'll know why in a second. I couldn't stand him. That's why I'll never forget him, right? Larry Miller had me taking offensive charge. I'm a freshman. All I want to do is score, Scott. I'm a scoring guard, right? That's in my mind. It's like, I want to be that shooting guard. And he had me as a point guard / shooting guard. But what he had me doing was taking offensive charges in practice constantly, and he expected me to do it in the game. He taught me how to slide my feet like you would not believe. And no matter how well I did it, I was running lines. If anyone ever played basketball, you know what lines are, but they're sprints and they're not fun and they're exhausting. And at the end of practice, I was constantly running lines because I wasn't doing something correct on defense. So after 2 years of this, I couldn't stand it. And I was begging my parents. Finally, they allowed me to transfer high school and to a different high school. And what does the coach say to me? When he's watching me play in a summer league before I go to my junior year in high school, he pulls me aside and he goes, who the hell taught you how to play defense like that? Who taught you how to take offensive charges? Who got you in such great shape? I mean, you don't even take a break and you're never out of breath. And I said, oh, my God, Larry Miller. I can't believe I'm going to actually say it was Larry Miller. Scotty gets better. I go and play at Syracuse University. Tommy Green, Mark Metters, Roy Danforth, the coaches, are asking me the same questions. Like, where did you learn this defensive tenacity? Where did you learn to take these offensive fouls? Oh, the other thing that Larry Miller taught me is I'm only 5'11", but I used to rebound, at Division I, right inside, man. I loved to get physical. I loved boxing out. And this is when we actually used to box out, Scott. I don't see it very much in basketball anymore, but, we really boxed out. And so I got so much out of the defense. But when people were asking me in college, where'd you learn this? I had to keep saying Larry Miller. I couldn't. But, I owe it all to Larry Miller. And this is another thing that we talk about in the book. You may have a coach that you can't stand. You may have a coach that rides you constantly. Learn to take it as a compliment. Mm-hmm. Learn to take it that they see what you can't see, that they know you have potential. Larry Miller knew I had potential. And Scott, trust me, I shot my face off. The second I got away from Larry Miller, I made up for all the times that I wasn't a scorer. And the last couple of years, in high school, I was a scorer. Even at Syracuse, my second year, I averaged 10 points a game, which is a lot, and at that level, 83% from the free throw line. So I did finally get a chance to get out from under Larry Miller's wings. But I will tell you, the guy that I didn't like that much was the one that allowed me to get as far as I got.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You got to just grin and bear it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
My favorite basketball player of all time is Larry Bird. I could sit and watch videos on YouTube about. And it's not even so much his highlight reels that I watch. I watch other NBA players that played against him talk about him. And it's just incredible that, most people, there'll be sort of differing opinions. To a man, every one of them said he was the most competitive, person that, and Michael Jordan, obviously the same.
Yeah.
That level of competitiveness, that level of mental toughness, how much of that is someone born with, and how much of that is developed over the years?
Scott, I don't know if there's a way to break down the percentage, but I can tell you this: anyone can learn it. Here's the good news. If you don't have it, when you're born, that ultra competitive drive, you can learn it. You really can, because we've taken kids with very low self-confidence, self-esteem, and turned them into freaking monsters. And it's a matter of, is the child or the young athlete willing to do whatever it takes to make the team, to be a part of the team? Are they willing? Are they coachable? Are they trainable? These are huge questions. And, as parents, and going back to the father that contacted me about the 12-year-old golfer who, according to the dad and a bunch of other people, say that he is on the level of almost a pro player already. I haven't seen any film of him. I'm waiting to take a look at it. But, these kind of kids have a lot of potential. But, his number one struggle right now has to be changed. Because if he loses it emotionally every time something doesn't go his way, there's going to be a stopgap. All right, he's going to only get so far. What I'm amazed at is the number of athletes that I've worked with that have what we call complete emotional regulation, which means that no matter what, Jalen Hurts is a great example. Watching him last night, it doesn't really matter what's going on in the field. If you look at his eyes, they stay the same the whole time. At times he looks like he's in a meditative trance on the bench, like he's unaffected. As a matter of fact, they were flashing to him when the Dolphins were on a scoring drive and they scored, and they flashed back to Jalen Hurts, and it was as if someone had just said, how are you doing? That was the expression on his face.
His expression doesn't change, up, down, tide, whatever. Just, okay, my turn now. And
that's right.
Right.
And then you have someone like Patrick Beverley in the NBA. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Patrick.
Oh, yeah.
Most people are.
Yeah.
Patrick is one of those guys that everyone says when he's on your team, it's fine. But when he's on the opponent's team, it's not fine.
Yeah.
He's a wild card. And then the other thing that we talk about, which is really important for every level of athlete to understand, is that when your role changes, as Russell Westbrook did last year and Kyle Lowry, two starters became role players. They came off the bench. Kyle Lowry started the whole year for Miami, and then he comes off the bench now he did have some injuries, but he still came off the bench the whole time during the playoffs. And if you were to, because basketball, of course, is my first love, and then everything else is just pure joy as well. But basketball is really where, I love to sink my teeth into it. Russell Westbrook, one of the most amazing guards the NBA has ever seen, is asked to come off the bench for the Los Angeles Lakers. And every Laker interviewed to a man said the same thing. He came into work, whether he was starting or coming off the bench, with the most infectious attitude, the greatest laugh. If he was coming off the bench, he worked just as hard in practice as if he was starting. Now, you think of that integrity, right? Like, he could have copped an attitude. Kyle Lowry could have copped an attitude, and said, oh, this is BS. I deserve to start over X, Y, or Z. But they didn't. And we highlight these things in our book, Scott, so that other athletes, listen, there's a thing called the small ego, and it can get quite big when you get to that level of athleticism. And there's a lot of professional athletes that don't like to take advice. They want to believe that what they're doing it right, and they don't need you, and they don't need anyone else telling them what to do. But they do. And when you look at a Russell Westbrook not complaining, Kyle Lowry not complaining, coming off and doing whatever is necessary for the team, those examples need to be highlighted a heck of a lot more than they are in sports right now.
Well, Kyle Lowry is obviously quite a hero up here in Canada, yes. Leading the Raptors to their only ever championship. And I think what people loved about Kyle Lowry is exactly what you said. He would do whatever it took. And he's, in basketball terms, is not a big guy either. And he is a master at taking charges. Yes. And getting in there, getting dirty defensively. And, I think fans, as much as fans love the scorers, they love the flashy players, there's a kind of a working man attitude about guys like Kyle Lowry that I think is easier for most people to sort of grab onto.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at his footwork in the paint, Scott, he has as good a footwork as any big man, basically, I've seen. He handles the ball so well, but he can get in the post and he can score over 7-footers. We've seen him do it his whole career, for gosh sake, So he's a crafty man. He has learned, I think he's 6 foot. He's learned how to take advantage of whatever he has. His body size, he's strong, he's stout, he's strong, he's solid, he's hard as heck to move. And he is excited. Him and Kevin Love, are two of the best at taking offensive charges, So also in the book, Scott, we talk about something a lot that most people outside of athletics, if you don't work with professional athletes, aren't aware of: the amount of addiction that goes on at the NBA, NFL, MLB level. The incredible amount of challenges that individuals have with anxiety, depression, family relationships. I mean, many of these athletes are on the road 60 to 70% of the year. So imagine not being with your partner, not seeing your children, as someone who works 9 to 5 and comes home and they're there every weekend. There's a lot of challenges. The American College of Sports Medicine not long ago came out with this mind-blowing survey. And they said, this is going to be totally underreported, and I'll explain why in a minute. But according to their study, 35% of elite athletes all around the world right now are struggling with mental health issues, including ADD, which is coming out of the woodwork with so many of these athletes. Coaches are having a hard time keeping players' attention, the younger players especially attention. So the American College of Sports Medicine comes out this and says 35% of these elite athletes with enough money to hire all the experts in the world to help them are struggling deeply. And so, but we know that those numbers aren't accurate, Scott. In our private practice, it's about 60% of professional elite athletes are struggling with something right now. They were traded and they didn't want to be traded. They have a new role that they didn't want to take. They're going through a divorce. Their mom or dad was just diagnosed with dementia. We talked about eating disorders. My gosh, if you remember Lamar Odom, former NBA potential, one of the great. I remember seeing him as a freshman at University of Rhode Island. I was lucky enough to see him his first year. He went right to the pros after that. But when I was working with people that knew him, he basically subsisted on sugar. And I'm not calling him out because I loved his game. I really did. When he was at his best, I just loved his game. But, there were many players. Dwayne Wade has said many times one of the greatest moves that he ever made was hiring a nutritionist, and it was really hard. And he ate more salads in the first 30 days, he said, than he had eaten in his whole life. But that gave him sustainable energy. The type of food he was eating wasn't great for an athlete, and athletes can get away with that kind of stuff up to a certain point. Mm-hmm. And then they have to get super clean, and they've got to be committed, like the people who they call crazy, the Novak Djokovic's, LeBron James. LeBron James has even quoted himself. He spends about $1.5 million a year on self-care. That's massage, that's a nutritionist, that's a personal trainer, that's a Pilates instructor, that's a yoga instructor. I mean, you name it. He has a cryotherapy. I mean, everything in the world you can imagine. And now you look at it and you go, holy cow, the commitment he made to his self-care has extended his career 20 years, for gosh sake, and he might have another couple left. We'll have to see. But, when the American College of Sports Medicine came out, that grabbed my attention. And it's one of the things that said to me, now is the time to write the book, because we know it's much higher than 35%. But even 35% is a huge number when you think about these athletes that have everything at their hands. I mean, all kinds of assistance and help is available, but a lot of them don't take it. And we're hoping to change that even with the book, Scott.
And how hard is it for a kid? We talked about Kyle Lowry, comes from South Philly, not a great, upbringing, let's call it, not, wealthy or by any means. But with basketball players, since we're on that topic, how hard is it for kids coming out of those kind of environments? And now they're at the top of the world. They're getting these huge paychecks. I'm just thinking about how that would be for myself. That would be mind-boggling to all of a sudden have the world at your feet like that. Is that something that you work with athletes on? Is that transition into that kind of professional world where you do have money, you have all, these amenities, at your disposal?
Yeah, and look at what happened to John Morant. Mm-hmm. Right? All the money in the world. I mean, incredibly gifted player, incredibly intelligent player, a high basketball IQ, et cetera. And it doesn't help when you don't have that guidance. You come out, you're young, all of a sudden you've got, $200 million contract. And unless you have guidance, either someone like myself or another pro on your team that can take you down the right roadway, it's going to be very hard to manage that. I mean, temptation's all around. And that I mentioned earlier about the world of addiction. I have a quote from one of my NBA players in the book that talked about certain teams he was on. It was almost mandatory that you go out after games. And I'm sitting there listening to this going, this is really enlightening to me. Like, I wouldn't imagine at that level that there'd be that much peer pressure to go out and party or hit the club scene, but there is, especially amongst many of the younger players. So these are the type of things that we need to be highly aware of as fans. I always say to people when they get, super upset with their star player that's off for 2 or 3 or 4 games, listen, have some empathy and compassion. Yeah, they're making $200 million a year or whatever it is, but we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We really don't. With John Morant, I'm not really quite sure, other than peer pressure from childhood friends or something else, of why he was willing to risk his career 2 times that we know of for sure. And now he's missing the first 25 games of the season. We need mentors. We really do. And guys coming in not 16 or 17 anymore, but 18, 19. Gosh, I was just watching a young player the other day that came in straight to the NBA. But what he did first was he went to the G League. So he played a year in the G League, the lower division of the NBA. And after playing for that year, now he's in the NBA. And, my question whenever I see a kid is 19 years of age, making millions of dollars coming in, I'm always praying that they have some type of guidance. Now, Memphis brought in Derrick Rose I believe he was with the New York Knicks when they traded for him, or he was actually unsigned, it could have been, but they brought him in to be a mentor for John Morant. Now, Derrick Rose said right off the top, do not think that I'm a babysitter. I'm coming in here to push this kid. I'm not coming in here to hold his hand. We'll see what happens. But that was probably needed the first year John Morant came into the league. Unfortunately, it wasn't done, or he rejected the help or something that got him into trouble.
Hey everybody, this is Scott, the host of the Sunday Morning Coffee Podcast. I would like to invite you to support the show through our Patreon page at patreon.com/smcpod. That's patreon.com/smcpod, where for only $4 per month, you can get early access to episodes and members-only content. Once again, that's patreon.com/smcpod, and I thank you for your support. So I'm going to switch gears to a little bit of a story about a different sport that is near and dear to my heart. I'll call it football. It's more known as soccer in North America. So my favorite football team is Liverpool, and they have a manager, Jurgen Klopp, who is pretty much legendary at the moment. And there's a story about they were playing in a big game, a cup final. I think it was his second year there, maybe. And they lost, and all the players were obviously devastated because it was a European Cup final, Europa League final. And he came in, and the players were all down. And he said, basically, everybody, meet in whatever room in 15 minutes. And, we're gonna have a little celebration. And the players are thinking, like, we just lost. Why are we celebrating? Mm-hmm. And he said, because, basically we lost together as a team, and this is only the first step in our journey. And we have to remember these moments as well as the moments where we're triumphant. And after that, they went on to win league titles and European Cups. How much is that kind of an attitude? Like, yeah, we lost, but this is still a moment to reflect on what we accomplished together. How much is that kind of message important to send out to athletes and to teams?
Scott, it's crucially important, and it's rarely done. Honestly, it is rarely done. Now, that is called a teacher. That coach is a teacher, and he's teaching a valuable life lesson. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen that often. I'll tell you, the one coach I know that would go to that level would have been Phil Jackson. Mm-hmm. Phil Jackson had them reading, from Roman emperors. He had them reading all kinds of deep philosophical books. He would be making quotes in practice constantly. He would have the team reading books and discussing deep philosophical practices so that we don't become attached. And so the whole thing with attachment, it comes from Buddhism. And what Buddha said is that our suffering is caused by our desire that life should be different than it is. Right? So we think about that. The suffering is caused not from the loss, but from the fact that we didn't think we should lose. So Phil Jackson would take something like that and say, hey, listen, we're creating our own suffering. Yeah, we couldn't match their offense. We couldn't match their defense. We didn't play at our level, right? But there's no reason to be down right now. Because if you're attached and you have to win every game to be happy, the odds are you're not going to have a very successful season. And when you have teachers like that, and the soccer coach that you just told me, who I believe is just a great philosophical teacher, to be quite frank with you, that is so necessary, but it's extremely rare, Scott. I wish we could say that it happened all the time. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't other coaches doing this underneath the table, but there's very few that are bringing it onto the table and saying, this is what we do with our players, and this is how we handle losses, and this is how we handle this. It would be great to have them do it. I'm not sure if some coaches might think, we're not going to give our secrets away. Phil Jackson could have cared less. He was talking about it all the time, about what these different spiritual practices and Eastern teachings did to turn his life around. So he was just sharing what helped him, that helped his players. And it does make a difference. If you have, and think about this, Scott, I don't know, how many of any professional sports that the coaches are saying, I want you to read this book. I want you to read that book. But when we work with athletes, they're reading these type of books all the time, because the mental state is where you win and lose. It is your desire to play defense in any sport that creates the opportunity to win. And I'll go back to defense because of my experience with Larry Miller. I would never have imagined that without meeting him, I would not have made as a walk-on the Syracuse University basketball team. There is no doubt in my mind, Scott, I would never have made that team had it not been for someone I don't care for or didn't care for at the time, right?
At the time,
so,
yeah.
So we need to be looking at these principles that you and I are talking about tonight. We need to be looking for ways outside of our given sport to have mental fortitude, mental toughness, mental confidence, and the ability to let what doesn't work go. Again, I'm going to go back to a basketball quote. Reggie Miller says this all the time. When I played, if I missed 10 in a row, I shot the next 10 as if I had just made 10 in a row. That kind of mental fortitude. You can take it into soccer. You can take it into hockey. You can take it into baseball. You can take it anywhere you want to go. And one of the stories that we tell, or I should say one of the endorsements we get in the book is from a major league pitcher right now that we helped turn his career around. He had completely lost his fire. He had completely lost his motivation for many different reasons. And within about 8 months, we got his fire back. And when you see someone and you're working with them and they're dejected and they're down and they're being told they're going to be dropped to AAA if this doesn't change by then, or this doesn't change, that's a heavy hit. And, sitting with someone in that kind of mental disposition is not the easiest thing in the world. We're trained to do it, obviously, but it's still not the easiest thing because they're hurting, And then when you see them bounce back, any athlete, I think of athletes that have gone through major addiction. Max Crosby, the one of the top linebackers in the NFL with the Las Vegas Raiders. He just celebrated his 3rd year of sobriety, but he's mentioned many times he was an alcoholic as a little kid. He started drinking really young, and it just increased in high school, increased in college, increased in the pros until he had to take time off and go to a treatment center. These type of things that need to get out there, Scott, is part of my work, and is part of the reason why I am so appreciative of being on your show, because there's a lot of individuals, athletes and fans that aren't privy to this kind of information. I feel blessed to be, but I want to share it, because I see these athletes that have overcome massive challenges with their childhood. You talked about, being raised in a tough environment. Many of our athletes, Ernest Graham is someone that comes to mind. Ernest Graham was a All-American running back, University of Florida. He went on Tampa Bay Buccaneers, had a great career at Tampa Bay, both as a running back and special teams player. I got a chance to interview him, Scott. The interview was phenomenal. This is a guy that was raised in the slums, raised in the ghetto, raised in gangs. He said that at 10 years of age, he looked around and there was not one male member of his family that wasn't in jail. Cousins, uncles, they were all in jail from being in gun-related crimes, murder, drugs, etc. And I said to him, I go, Ernest, I said, Have you ever smoked a cigarette, a joint, had a drink, drugs? He smiled and said, no, nothing. I said, how do you come from that environment? How do you come from an environment where you awaken at 10 years of age and you look around and you say, all of my male relatives are in jail. I'm going to choose a different path. I said, Ernest, you're 10 years of age. How did that happen? And again, he's so humble. He just smiled and said, David, I'm not sure, but I do know this. At 10 years of age, I committed my life to sport, and sport saved my life. When you think about that, Scott, we think about so many of the professional players. Jimmy Butler, going back to him, I mean, there's so many stories of him sleeping on couches because he had nowhere. He was homeless in high school. And yet look at what they've done. I want to herald these guys. Go back to the Miami Heat, 7 undrafted players last year, and they went to the finals, right? It's like, you got to believe, man. You got to believe. You've got to have daily rituals of concentration, focus, faith. You have to have that outrageous amount of confidence. We call it extreme, out of control confidence. It really, that's what you need at that level. Now, you can have that out of control confidence without ever saying anything snarky. You don't have to, be someone that creates arguments. You don't have to be someone that's a badass. Confidence can come in quietness, as well as in passion and excitement. So, the number one thing with all these athletes is we look at what I mentioned earlier, their strengths are not their challenges. So what are their challenges? And let's start working on them. If they're emotionally based, if it's confidence based, if it's mental skill or physical skill based, let's go after those areas so that you can be the best all around athlete possible.
JJ Redick tells an incredible story about, I think he was a sophomore at Duke. And he was not committing himself. He was, partying. He was living the life of, being a star, big man on campus, the whole deal. And they lost in, I want to say the Final Four. It could have been the Elite Eight, but I think it was the Final Four. And Coach K met with him after the season was over and said, JJ, we didn't win a title this year because you are not yet worthy of being a champion. And JJ Redick says, coming from Coach K, that absolutely crushed him at the moment. But as that immediate sting wears off, he said he was right. And he committed himself. He got back to committing himself to basketball. And as we know, became one of the best shooters, ever. So obviously that is important, that you don't want to just have someone that's going to pat you on the back, but you need someone that's going to kick you in the ass and lay out some hard truths when they're needed. And it seems like Coach K was a great balance between the two of those things.
Yeah. And that's a hard thing to do. A lot of coaches, because I work with coaches too over the years, Scott, they step back a little bit sometimes when it comes to their star players and calling them out. I'm saying this at the high school, college, and pro levels. It's true. Whether we want to admit it or not, it's actually true. For Coach K to do it just tells you what a great teacher he is, doesn't it? It tells you, how wise and worldly he was. Charles Barkley has a great story about Moses Malone. When Charles came into the NBA, Moses was already well established, and he went up to Moses Malone as a teammate, and he said, great to meet you. And Moses Malone looked at him and he said, you're fat, you're slow, you're lazy. You ain't ever going to be an all-star. And he walks away. And Charles Barkley's going, my first introduction to my teammate, and this guy's telling me I'm fat, slow, and lazy. And then he comes back and says, lose 20 pounds, and walks away. Charles Barkley's going, what the heck kind of a welcome is that, right? So anyway, after he got over his little hurt ego, he lost 20 pounds. So he went from 290 to 270. And he goes up to Moses and he goes, Moses, he said, can you tell? And Moses said, what? He said, I lost 20 pounds. He said, Moses looked at him and said, you're fat, you're slow, you're lazy, you'll never be an all-star. And he walked away. Now Charles Barkley's going, what the heck is going on here? So then he got super determined. He's at 260. He goes, I got down to 240. And I walked up to Moses. I said, okay, now what do you think? Moses goes, you're too light. Get back to 250 and stay there. You'll be an all-star. And walked away. and Charles did it. And the rest is history. From the round mound of rebound in college, He went on to become a slightly less round mound of rebound, and he became, an amazing player. But again, here we have a mentor, whether it's a player or a coach, calling people out, telling them the truth and saying, if you want to go to that next level that you're talking about, you're thinking about, you better improve right now.
Another quote that I really love from an athlete, and again, getting back to hockey, being as it's the Canadian pastime,
Sure.
Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you never take.
Yeah.
And so how obviously it's incredibly important to get back on that horse, because as we know with baseball players, if you're failing 7 out of 10 times, you're an all-star.
Right.
You're making millions and millions of dollars a year. You're one of the best in the world.
Yep.
So how do you work with an athlete that may be having that kind of, crisis of confidence where they don't want to make a mistake?
Yeah.
But you have to teach them that, hey, it's okay to make a mistake because that's the only way you're going to end up succeeding.
Going back to the major league pitcher that had lost his fire and, was going to be put down to AAA, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that we did with him, you and I talked a few minutes ago about sizzle reels, is that we went and we started looking at him, and we had the team put together, the 4-minute reel of him just on fire. And one of the things that we recognized in this is that he was paying attention to the fans. It was in an opposing stadium, and they were all over his back, and he was eating it up. He loved it. So we had to try to simulate that experience in his head. We had to try to get him to see the fans booing him. Now, isn't this interesting? Because if you see what happened recently in Philadelphia in the playoffs, their star second baseman was in a massive slump. And he comes into the stadium, and I forget, he was like, 0 for 10 or 0 for something like that. He came into the stadium, and they gave him a standing ovation. Now, this was a guy that is motivated by positive validation, the second baseman for the Phillies. And so when the crowd went nuts, it lifted his spirits. Now, my pitcher was the opposite. My pitcher wanted people to boo him, wanted people to throw the things, and not literally throw things on the field, but you get the idea. He got off on people trying to tear him down. So as we were able to simulate those experiences and then have him do it in his mind, he slowly got his fire back. And forget it now, the guy's out of control. So you can take someone who is challenged by either, I talked about someone getting in their heads or having, a 20-game hitting streak go down to 0. It doesn't matter what the sport is. So much of it is mental, Scott. And one of the things that we do in sports psychology is that we have tools that we take these players through to regain their confidence. There's something we say remove first, add second. And what that means is remove the challenges first. Whatever it is that you're being challenged by, work on your game, your match to get rid of that first. And then we add second, which might mean that we add something outside of their sport. I tell stories in the book about Novak Djokovic, who's probably one of the most fascinating athletes I've ever read about. I have never had a chance to interview him yet, but I plan on it for sure. In so many of the interviews, what they've said about him is that his level of competition and his skill level improved dramatically after he found some areas of life that were lacking in his awareness. He had high sensitivity to gluten, to dairy, and he had to go complete gluten-free, dairy-free. He had to get to this most strictest of diets in order for him to rebound, because the food that he was eating was actually having a negative effect on his physical and mental performance. And then as you watch further the changes this gentleman has made, he calls himself a tree hugger. His whole family hugs trees. They do yoga. They do Pilates. He walks in the grass after matches and practice to ground himself. Now, think about all these things that I'm saying that seemingly have nothing to do with being an exceptional elite athlete, yet they have everything to do with it, Scott. And what we're finding is more and more of these athletes. LeBron James just came out and said he's been doing Pilates for 15 years. We're having more and more athletes looking at their diet, looking at how they handle stress, looking at their motivation, looking at their relationships, looking at their family situations. We have more people understanding finally that sport is more than what's going on the court. It's more than just that game. It's more than just that match. You know, the ability for someone to stay at a high level of expertise in any sport whatsoever is going to be based on a holistic approach in 2023. It's no longer just your skills are great enough. You know, I'm going to practice harder. You can only put so many hours into practice, and then it's going to come down to your mindset. If your mind is on game, your game will be on game. If your mind is off game, your game will be off. It is such a simple statement, Scott, but it's one of the most prolific ones that we say to our clients all the time to make sure they're making good choices with who they hang out with, what they listen to, what they watch, what they read. You know, these are all crucial parts of an athlete's I guess we'll say the new norm, right? The new normal. You look back 30 to 40 years ago, there was none of this talk. I mean, there wasn't even strength training, God. For when I played 43 years ago, I guess it was, at Syracuse, we didn't work out in the gym. If we did, it was minimal. You know, now you see guys that are doing plyometrics and constantly upgrading their training routines, which is something that we hadn't heard of before. I mentioned earlier dietary changes. You know, 30 years ago, they weren't talking about how important a dietary change and how important your pregame meal is and how important your postgame meal. You know, we know all this stuff now, thanks to science and research. So if you want to be an athlete at any level and your best, you've got to be well-rounded, Scott. You've got to be able to look at everything you and I are talking about on this show and apply it to your own game. You have to be able to rebound from losses quickly. There's no time to sit in your tears. I mean, yes, you have to feel, and we have our clients actually writing about their frustrations of losses, writing about their frustrations of being traded, writing about their frustrations of being on the bench now instead of a starter. But we need to learn how to move past these things. And that's what sports psychology does so well.
Especially in a sport like baseball, where you're playing pretty much every day.
Yeah.
For, you know, from April to hopefully October, if you make the playoffs. But there's no time to wallow in self-pity because you went 0 for 4. You've got to get on a plane, go to the next city, and play tomorrow. So that ability to bounce back is incredibly important.
Yeah, it really is. And I'm glad you mentioned baseball because, you know, it's one of those sports that is a slow sport, right? Compared to all the other sports basically that we're talking about. I mean, it's a slower sport and you have more time to think. And if you don't know how to use that time to think, then your thoughts can take you down some pretty dirty roads, you know? And I mean, you and I both know we could probably tell stories for another 2 or 3 hours of athletes that have lost it. Major League Baseball players that just lost their grip on the game, that, you know, had the potential to be super all-stars, but never rebounded after a bad season. And then we have other people that, you know, individuals said we'll talk about, you know, these individuals that are walking on, you know, non-scholarship collegiate athletes or whatever it might be. And the attitude that they have to bring to the court is unbelievably different than someone who is a high draft pick in the beginning. Everything I'm saying right now is about the mind, Scott. You know, everything is about the mind, and we need our athletes to be hyper aware that how they respond to anything is going to be crucial in regards to long-term playing in any sport. If I could do anything for the rest of my life, Scott, it's what I'm doing right now. Mm-hmm. And I find it extremely exciting. I find it rewarding beyond measure to be able to work with individuals and help them get to the next level, whatever that might mean. And there's many, many people that can get to a higher level than they are right now. They're just going to have to make a deeper commitment. And it might be a commitment, usually it is, into areas that they're not comfortable with. That's where the success lies.
One thing that fascinates me about high-level athletes is that sometimes, especially with the really great ones, it almost seems like when they're in their element in their sport or in the media, it's almost like they're playing a role. And there's another football/soccer player whose name is Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and he is known as one of the all-time confidence players that there's ever been. There's a famous story of when he signed after playing in Europe for his whole career. He signed to play in Los Angeles. LeBron James took out an ad in the LA Times, I think it was, welcoming him to Los Angeles. So Zlatan printed out, got a copy of the article, autographed it, said, "You're welcome, Zlatan," and sent it back to LeBron James. And I'm thinking, wow. Like, and then if you watch interviews with this guy, his confidence is next level.
Yeah.
Is that the case sometimes where athletes almost are in playing a certain role when they're in their arena versus when they're outside of their arena? And is that a way that they convince themselves, like, hey, I am who I say I am?
Scott, what we tell ourselves on a daily basis can be manifested if we follow it up with actions in a heartbeat. And so when I said before about extreme confidence, that's what we're talking about. Every athlete has to come to the table and somehow find it. And sometimes in the beginning, we're making it up. And I'm being very honest with you. You know, they don't have the confidence to go against a LeBron James. They're a rookie this year, let's say, and they find out they're guarding LeBron James tomorrow night, or any other sport you could talk about the same thing. They have to believe that they are able to play at his level. They have to believe it to get on the court, or they're going to get chewed up. You know, they're going to absolutely get chewed up and spit out. So we want players to have that extreme level of confidence. Now, arrogance and confidence are two totally different ball games. You know, so we're not talking about arrogance here. We're staying away from arrogance. We're talking about confidence. You know, when you mention confidence, I got to tell you, the first name that came to my mind is Tom Brady.
Mm.
I look at the number of comebacks that gentleman has created in the NFL over his 20 plus years in the NFL. I think he was there 21 years. How that guy was unstoppable. How many times in a Super Bowl arena, a Super Bowl setting, a playoff setting, did he pull off and you never saw him sweat? I mean, yeah, I've never seen that. I mean, yeah, did he get frustrated a couple of times? Sure. But you see him coming in. There's the 2-minute drill, right? The famous 2-minute drill. He comes in, there's 2 minutes left in the game, and he marches a team down the field like there's not even a defensive opponent in front of him. And he's making these ridiculous throws, and the receivers are making incredible catches. But where does this all stem from? That unshakable confidence. Yeah, there's 2 minutes left in the game. Yeah, we're down by 10 points. Yes, we will win.
And he's another one that looks like when he's in the midst of it that he's grocery shopping.
Like I love that analogy.
There's just like, oh, this is what I do.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do it again, and there's nothing you can do about it.
That's right.
You know, as I always hated the Patriots and Tom Brady, but I hated them because of how damn good they were. Mm-hmm. And when they're, you know, I'm a Broncos fan, and if he gets the ball with a minute left down by 5 points, you're like, oh, damn, here we go again.
I know it.
And that's such an incredible compliment to him, just because you just know what's going to happen, and he knows what's going to happen.
Yeah. I'm fascinated that you mentioned Denver. In the book, 3 pages in, there's a picture of me and Floyd Little. Floyd Little was called the franchise by the Denver Broncos. He was an All-American running back at Syracuse, of course, for 3 years in a row. And then he became, he's in the Hall of Fame with Denver. And they basically said that he revived football in Denver by himself. That's why they called him the franchise. He was a man of immense confidence. He died last year. He was a man of immense confidence. He was so humble, Scott. He introduced me several times at Syracuse University events I was speaking at. I went to see him speaking at events, and he would always talk to me and mention me to the crowd. I mean, the guy was just incredible. He blew my mind. When I did a presentation at the Syracuse alumni chancellor, or to the Syracuse University chancellor's office, he had brought in a number of students and then certain faculty to this presentation that I gave at the chancellor's office. And this was the very first time I had met Floyd, as a matter of fact. Scott, he stood up in front of the group after my presentation was done, and he brought up like 10 points that I had made. Now, he had no notes in his hands, right? But he came to the front and he goes, okay, oh my gosh, I've been waiting to hear this guy too. Now, let's take a listen to what he shared with us. Let's take a look at it, listen to the most. This guy was incredible. David blew our minds. Let's take a look at. And I'm sitting there going, this is Floyd Little. He's a Hall of Famer. And he's talking about me as if I'm the Hall of Famer. Mm-hmm. Scott, so many athletes are like this. We don't realize that they may have a game face of arrogance. They may have, a tough talk and that, but off the field, you'd be surprised at how many are humble and soft and gentle. I tell in the book, my favorite basketball star when I was growing up, who I mimicked every move he made, was Earl the Pearl Monroe. And if people don't know Earl the Pearl Monroe, please Google him, YouTube. This guy was one of the most amazing players I've ever seen. And he used to do, when I was in high school, they called me Earl the Pearl Essel, because all I would do was talk about Earl the Pearl Monroe, and I would do his reverse spin, his fake reverse spin, his double reverse spin. I copied every one of his moves. Well, my publicist found his address, and he contacted him via email and said, there's a client of mine who's a sports psychologist who wrote a book, and he mentioned you, and that he met you at 10 years of age, and that we want to get you a copy of the book. And Earl responded immediately to TJ and said, yes, definitely have David send a book. So I did, and I put a note in there, about meeting him at 10 and how he had such a huge impact in my life. And that if he ever wanted to text me, I would jump out of my skin and would love it, And so we'll see. I haven't heard from him yet. He should have gotten the book yesterday or today, possibly. But I'm excited because this is what I want to share. I want to share the reality of our athletes. Like the fact that he took the time to respond via email and to say, sure, have David send the book here is just, wonderful. And many of these stories, when you brought up Denver and I get a chance to talk about Floyd Little, there may be listeners that aren't familiar with some of these names, but Google them. Mm-hmm. Google these incredible athletes and the contribution they've made to this world, not only in sport, but out of sport as well.
Let's switch gears a little bit from confidence to the opposite. One of the things that really fascinates me about sports is when athletes get what is very commonly known as the yips. Mm-hmm. And a famous example that I remember is a baseball player, second baseman Steve Sachs, could not throw the ball to first base. And there was also a catcher that could not throw the ball back to the pitcher. Like if it came to throwing someone out at second, he could do that. He could do everything. But the thing he does 100+ times a game, he just couldn't do it. Yeah. Have you come across athletes that have run, and be it free throws, be it whatever, that have the yips? And how do you work through that with them?
The very first thing we do, Scott, is find out the origin of it. There's an origin for every dysfunction. There's something that happened. Was it a comment someone made? Let's go back to Steve Sachs and let's say, did he in one game miss the first baseman? He bounced it to him or he threw it over his head or something like that, and he didn't address it. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't want to, to bring it up. And what we have to do in the world of athletics, just when I work with executives, it's the same thing, Scott, is we find what's the origin. Where did the decrease in revenue start? Where did the increase in expenses begin? If we're talking executives or a small business owner, in Major League Sports, it's the same thing. When did this happen? Where I started to be feeling anxiety throwing it to the first base or anxiety throwing it back to. If we can't find the origin, which we always can, by the way, but if we couldn't find the origin, we couldn't find a solution. But you find the origin, and then you can walk back and find the solution. And one thing I would say to Steve Sachs is, how soon after the yips started did you ask for help? And one of the problems that happens, Scott, and this is a very interesting conversation we're having right now, because I'm going to jump into the conscious versus subconscious mind. The conscious mind is the mind of a 10. Like I had on my schedule today to call you at 6:00 for this interview. Okay, so that's my conscious mind writing it down. And then at 5:30, looking at my calendar, looking at the watch, this is all consciousness. The subconscious mind, let's say that I was anxious about this interview tonight. Let's say I was nervous about coming on the air with you. I might have forgotten to do the interview because the subconscious mind had a fear. Oh my God, Scott might ask me a question I don't have an answer to. And if that is an insecurity of mine, the subconscious mind could have me forget the call. Does that make sense to you, Scott?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Absolutely.
So the conscious mind is the mind of intent, but the subconscious mind is the mind that we have to really pay attention to, especially when we're facing something like the yips. When we're facing, I talked about Patrick Beverley earlier. I had an NBA player that couldn't stand him, and Patrick would get into his head every freaking game. That's not unlike having the yips, right?
Mm-hmm.
With this basketball player, it was only with one other player, but it was something that was in his mind all the time. So we've got to get into that, find the origin. When we find the origin of whatever it is that's creating that insecurity, we can create the solution.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I sort of go through that doing these interviews with, because I try not to schedule too many questions, because I like it to be free flowing and just go where the conversation leads. But then I'm thinking, with 15 minutes to go, what am I going to ask? What if I run out of questions? Is the conversation, am I going to be interesting? And then, so I usually sit down at my computer 10 minutes before and log into the stream. So sometimes maybe I'll wait a couple of more minutes. Maybe I'll do it 8 minutes before. And then I sit down, I start the interview like I did with you. It goes fantastic. And then I think, why the hell was I anxious about this? And I don't think I have ever sat down and truly asked the why to myself. Why do I feel that way?
Yeah, I would, Scott. And I would go back in time and I would try to figure out where it started, why it started, how it started. But wait, I would also say, look outside of your podcast. Is there something outside of your podcast? As an example, like if you went to a networking event, does it make you nervous to go to a networking event? Because whenever you have something like that where you're really good at what you do, Scott, and so you don't have to have any kind of insecurity or fear. What if I run out of questions? You just don't. Okay, take my word for it. I've been on the air with you for an hour. You don't have a problem with that. But where did it start? That's what I would look for. Where did a little bit of insecurity come into play? Did I do a podcast one time and I spaced out on Bryce Harper's name like I did? Okay, I'm a sports psychologist and I forget Bryce Harper's name. Now, if I had a high level of insecurity, I may have freaked out during that moment with you, right? I might have said, oh my God, I'm a sports psychologist. I can't remember this famous baseball player's name. What the heck is going on? But I didn't. Now, it's not because I'm some amazing, immaculate, incredible performer. It's because I knew that one of us would come up with it. But if we didn't, it wasn't the end of the world. If we never came up with Bryce Harper's name, there'll be, 300,000 people at home screaming Bryce Harper at us, but we can't hear them because they're not in the studio.
I hope it's 300,000 people.
Right, exactly. So that now that you know, Scott, we did a little background check 15 minutes ago, and we have 300,000 listeners. So just as an FYI for you, you're doing great.
Perfect. Okay. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yes,
but
yes.
It is amazing how that and everything that you've been talking about with athletes is so relatable for everybody, even if you're not an athlete at all, even if you've never picked up a ball in your life. So to wrap it up, so I don't keep you all night because I could, what's one piece of advice that you would give to your athletes that you work with that you think everybody should heed?
I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. If your relationship is struggling, what is your role? What is the origin of it? If we're struggling with anything whatsoever, do not let a struggle or a challenge go by. Don't bypass it and think, oh, it was just one game, it won't happen again. We call in athletics or in any of my counseling work, Scott, we call for people to look for patterns. So, the pattern is I can't hit a slider. The pattern is Patrick Beverley drives me insane and my game is always off. But the pattern is this. If I could leave everyone with one advice, whether you're an athlete or not, is look at the one area of life that you're struggling with the most and attack it starting tonight, not even tomorrow. Write it down on a piece of paper. Think about who can help you. Do you have to hire someone? Is there someone that's an accountability partner that's brighter than you, smarter than you in regards to whatever your challenge is? Write down your challenge today, and by tonight or tomorrow at the latest, try to figure out who you're going to go to get help with. Or is there something on YouTube? Can you Google YouTube about how to overcome this? Is there something on Google? Can you Google on, how do you overcome this insecurity or this lack of confidence? too many times, Scott, in our regular life, if we're not athletes or we're athletes, we allow a challenge to go on too long and it becomes embedded in the subconscious. And once that happens, it's just like Steve Sachs and the Yips, right? Once it's embedded in the subconscious, it can be difficult to uproot. Now, we can uproot anything. Okay, there's addictions. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter how long someone has struggled. Max Crosby, I mentioned before, the NFL end, had struggled since he was like 6 or 8 with alcoholism. I mean, it had been a part of his life for such a long time, which means it was a pattern in his subconscious. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance personally to work with Max Crosby, although I have sent him the book and told him he's a rock star for what he's doing in the world of addiction. But if I were able to talk to him, these are the discussions we would have. How did he uproot in his subconscious mind the desire for alcohol on a daily basis? That's what we need to do. So whether you're at home and you're not an athlete, but you're struggling with finances or your relationship or your weight or your health, this is what we want to do. Whatever the greatest struggle you're having is, let's take some time and heal. Even if it takes 6 months or a year, it's going to be worth it down the road. And for everyone, I just want to remind Scott that everyone can get the Audible copy of our book, Mental Mastery and Maximum Performance for Professional Athletes, absolutely free at talkdavid.com. If you want to buy the book, go right to Amazon. If you want the free Audible, go to talkdavid.com and you'll have a blast listening to it, I promise.
Well, I'm definitely going to download that audiobook. And it reminds me of another book that I've just started called The Obstacle is the Way. And it's basically about how, the obstacles that you have in your life and overcoming them is the way to achieve what you want. And that sounds a lot like what you were just saying, is first identify why and then work on the how.
Absolutely, Scott. And it is the same. It's the same for everything. Our strengths are not our challenge. Our weaknesses are. Never forget that.
I really appreciate your time. This has been amazing. I could, being a sports nut myself, I could talk to you for hours on this, but I really appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to diving into that audiobook.
Scott, I think you're going to love it. There's a lot of really fun stories in there, and keep doing what you're doing. Keep putting it out there. We need these kind of shows because there's so much insanity in the world. The world is struggling, Scott, to have a show that's positive, that's uplifting, that's giving great messages. My hat is off to you. Keep doing your great work. We need you. Okay.
Absolutely. And same to you. It's
Thanks,
been a pleasure
Scott.
to speak to you.
Great to talk to you. Have a beautiful rest of your day.
Thank you, sir. You too.